to come up with one.
This meeting is being recorded.
We want to come up with one very strong allocation that's indicative of each of these senses. So for example, for plant 1, we're going to pick the word leaf. And for plant 2, we're going to pick the word factory. So now we're going to do the classifier that looks at all the unlabeled data, and if it sees that the word plant appears near leaf, it will label it in sense 1, and if it sees factory to label it, it's sense 2. Now, since these are only single examples of each of the classes, we can only label a small percent of the data. Let's say, for the sake of example, 1% for the first sense, plant 1, and 1% for plant 2, and the rest of the label and the rest of the corpus will not label yet. 98% will be residual. How the bootstrapping process works. Now we're going to do the classifier that's going to look for other objects that were not classified previously, and it's going to look for additional collocations that appear in those labels examples. So for example, if we have a sentence where the word plant appears near leaf and near leaving, where we use leaf already as a feature. But now we can learn that living it's not also a good feature that labels the particular sense. So somehow it's the process of bootstrapping. We're going to expand from first C to some small number of labeled examples, then back to more features that are associated with each of these classes, and then I get to training a supervised classifier, and then we're going to get more label data, and this process is going to continue until pretty much all of the data points have been classified one way or another. A decision list algorithm is used to identify other reliable collocations. This training algorithm calculated the probability with this formula and ranked by the log likelihood ratio. Later, smoothing algorithm will be used to avoid zeros, and the decision list algorithm resolves many problems in a large set of non-independent evidence sources by using only the most reliable piece of evidence rather than the whole matching collocation set. The new resulting classifier will then be able to do the whole. They will then apply to whole sample set, add these samples in their residual that are tagged as A or B. It means that the first sense or second sense, actually, with probability above a reasonable threshold to the seed set. The decision list algorithm and the above adding steps are applied iteratively. As more newly learned collocation are added to the seed sets, the first and second sense will be equal, and the original residual will shrink. However, these collocations stay in the seed sets only if the probability of classification remains above the threshold. Otherwise, they are returned to the residual for later classification. At the end of each iteration, the one sense per discourse property can be used to help preventing initially mistagged collocations and hence improving the purity of the label sets. This is how the intermediate state will be. And this is a final it's how final states looks like. The algorithm will converge on a stable residual set. An example of a final decision list for a plant is as following. As you can see, the original seeds words are no longer at the top of the list. They have been displaced by more broadly applicable collocations. Mirsky algorithm was not mathematically well understood until this paper analyzed some specific variations of the algorithm and also proposed some new algorithms for bootstrapping. And now let's go to the second part. In semi-supervised approach, we do have labels at certain points, but we don't have lots of labels. And what we're trying to do is we are trying to predict labels for all of the points, but you're also trying to use a similarity between the unlabeled data. Then you can try to look for additional information in this structure of the data. And so we have these partial labeled sets. This approaches to the semi-supervised learning is following based on the attributes of all the points of the features. We actually construct a similarity graph. We connect these nodes with edges based on the similarity between nodes and a similarity of nodes and similarity of points computed from their features. And then we use graph structure to try to predict labels on the rest of the nodes. And so we just really should realize that this is pretty much the problem that we're trying to solve with label propagation as well, except for that we did not build a similarity graph. We already given the graph. And this problem is it's actually not a typical semi-supervised learning using graphs. There are two main approaches in semi-supervised learning, graph-based and consistency-based. And our focus is on a graph-based approach, which is a label propagation. In this paper, they use, which is a very influential paper back then, and it's over the label propagation. They use unlabeled data to help label data in classification. It proposes simple iterative algorithm, label propagation, to propagate labels through the dataset along with density areas defined by unlabeled data. Using unlabeled data together with labeled data is of both a theoretical and a practical interest. Among them, there is a promising family of methods which assume that closer the data points tend to have similar classes labels in a manner analogous to K-nearest neighbor in traditional supervised learning. As a result, these methods propagate labels through the dense unlabeled data regions. This is how we define the problem. The edge between any nodes is weighted so that the closer the nodes are in local equidistance distance, the larger the weight. And we let the labels of the nodes propagate to all nodes through the edges, which is calculated by those formulas. And this is the formulation of label propagation. This is the label, the result of label propagation on tree bands and spring data set. As the figure shows, KNN ignores unlabeled data structures, but label propagation successfully can identify them. In this section is it's from another paper which I think that exemplifies which makes it really simpler how a label propagation works, and it exemplifies it with electronic network. We take our data points and we build a graph on them, which means that we draw edges between some pairs of points, and choosing which edges to draw is completely a different topic, which we're not going to discuss here. So let's assume that we have the edges, and we're going to put edge weights on them that describe the similarity between the endpoints. So if 2 points are very similar, the edge weights between them is going to be large, and then we propagate the labels from the label to the unlabeled points through the edges on the graph. And the way we do it is that we pretend that the graph is an electronic network, and we cut and we have every edge is a resistor. Those resistance is inverse of its weight, and then we connect the power source to the graph to fix the electronic potential at the blue nodes to 0, and at the red nodes to 1. So there are the labeled nodes. This sends electric flow through the graph and induces electric potential at the rest of the node. And those potentials are exactly the labels that a label propagation computes through those nodes. And there are numbers between 0 and 1. If you want to classify, we pick a threshold, and how do we compute them? We know from electronic engineering that we can compute them by that formula, a quadratic function, which is called energy of graph. So we can also do that efficiently, and this is how it's an algorithm, how a label propagation algorithm can be simplified with. Let's see what it does in practice. So 2 examples. First, suppose the points are organized in 2 circles, and we have 2 label points, one white on the outer circle and one blue on the inner circle. And we run the algorithm, and it classifies their circles correctly, as the picture illustrates. A more realistic example, we took a grayscale image and then manually puts small colors on the image. So now that the color pixels are labeled ones, and then they propagate the colors with this algorithm, and we get the natural image colorfully with label propagation. This is another paper which is from 2019. Classic methods on semi-supervised learning that have focused on transductive learning have not been fully exploited in the inductive frameworks followed by modern deep learning. In this paper, they employed a transductive label propagation method that's based on the assumption to make a prediction on the entire data set, and use these predictions to generate pseudo labels for the unlabeled data and train a deep neural network. At the core of the transductive method lies a nearest neighbor graph of the data set that it creates based on the embeddings of the same network. Therefore, their learning process iterates between these 2 steps. And there is some other, actually, I think that Yarovsky algorithm was really influential, and we do the same in label propagation, and we also have other machine learning realms that we're using hierarchy algorithm, for example, in code training and self-supervising, and also in active learning and meta learning. I think that a hierarchy algorithm has a very big impact. And these are the references I used for this lecture. If you have any questions.
Thank you.
Hey, I have a question. Thank you for your talk. If you could go back to the image with a couple more slides back where you showed with the voltages connecting to the graph. Yes, this one. So in the formula below, we're trying to find the minimum f that minimizes this function. Is f like a label assignment, or what is f in this? I'm trying to understand the formula a bit better.
It's a good question. It didn't occur to me.
I think that's a right interpretation. The F is a label assignment. Rather, it's a probability assignment, right, to each node, I think.
Oh.
So it's so for the nodes that are 50-50, red blue would be like 0.5. I don't know. It's my guess.
It's just it's a really influential image. I thought it was a cool way to do this. So okay.
I think just maybe sorry. So the idea, I think, is just for example, F can be like the model you train it on a labeled data, for example. And since you have like limited label data, you can kind of use this encoder to label new points, and you kind of connecting your data like as a graph, and then this you like, and then you can compute this kind of minimization, and that's all. Like, so you take samples from your data, label them, then compute scoring based on this, and then optimize. And then you kind of connecting your data points as a graph. And this is, I think, how like label propagates through the graph.
That does make sense. So F is our model, and it is putting out those assignments of labels. So by finding the F that minimizes this function, it's a good label assignment.
I think it just like relates based on like labels for your kind of samples. So, for example, you have a weight, and you should probably connect like samples that closer should be like probably similar, related, and then you want to find the function that kind of separates kind of groups and makes like some samples to be grouped together.
Okay, that makes sense.
Isn't it just minimizing the weight, the label that is assigned to node X and node Y that are connected? Because what you're doing is you're taking XY, a tuple from the edges, and then WXI is just the weight of that edge. And so what it's doing is it's just minimizing the difference between nodes that have the same value after the function. So if your nodes are like very importantly connected, they should have a more similar value. So in this case, purple is like, they should both be purple. It's just the difference between the assignment that you give it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's weighted by the edge weight W.
But isn't that that will be like two-step approach? Like you first you need a graph, and then like you're updating graph first, and then you update the
so it actually takes time. So what you have to do you have to repeat this process a couple of times until you find a stable solution, and that's when you stop and you assign the labels. Because I've also used this in my own research, and you have to do this multiple times because this is not like a one-step approach, or it depends on the graph. But oftentimes you have to take like 3 times, you have to iterate through the graph, update the new kind of like value for each node, and then you do a next iteration where you update the values of the node again based on the new values for each node, et cetera, until you kind of converge, and that's when you determine what the labels are. I think that's also why electronics is a good example, because obviously, like, it takes some time before there's a convergence in the electronic circuit. I mean, it looks instantaneous to us, but obviously on like a nanoscale, it takes some time before it's like fully in a converged position. So yeah, you would have to do this multiple times, by the way. Like, you have a time, you iterate multiple times over the graph to get new assignments, essentially, until you have a convergence.
Yeah. I think I'm not entirely clear on how this graph is actually built, and I would expect that the topology of the graph would affect that. Could you maybe go back? Do you have a slide where you go describe how the graph is constructed from the samples?
For example, nodes with like super high degree, they will always be in more of like a switch on, switch off state, for example, especially if they're in the middle between 2 different labels. Because if they get a lot of information from the one class and a lot of information from the other class, they may switch on and off between the class each time you update the labels.
Okay, so you just have a distance. I see. Okay. They just use the Euclidean distance. That's all. Okay, that's all.
And oftentimes, what they also do is just threshold to determine the edges, and then only assign the weights to the ones that are above a certain value.
Right. Yeah. How do you pick that threshold?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But I feel like generally, like, it's the same thing with like network neuroscience. People have kind of like found something that like works well enough for a lot of these metrics. You know what I mean? Like if you, for example, have the correlation between 2 nodes and you want to make a graph out of it, you obviously, having a fully connected graph is not like the most, optimal way of doing it. So oftentimes people are just like kind of looking at what makes sense, and they pick maybe 0.2 to be like the cutoff for like whether 2 nodes have a connection in the brain. I actually recently saw a tweet about like there was a whole lecture about picking thresholds for generating these graphs for the brain specifically. So I mean, it is actually a very important hyperparameter, and people do work on that. But yeah, it has a huge. Sorry.
I was wondering if you could look at like some graph metrics. So when you pick a threshold for the weights, if you can look at the small worldness of the graph and know that it will not or will propagate better or worse. I don't know if that's been looked at all.
There has been.
It has.
So
Yeah.
One of the tricks that they like is to gather up the distribution of shortest paths, and there's been work to find how that changes over a threshold.
Yeah, exactly.
It basically ties into graph topology.
Yeah.
Of like filtration. You're filtrating over the threshold to the edges.
Right. And
what's her name? Bassett and Sporns.
Yeah,
and
Daniel Bassett, and yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Actually, the brain is like considered a very efficient small world network. Has a lot of small worldness. There's like a lot of work actually in this field, like a lot of work, because so yeah, they just pick a threshold, and I think currently it's pretty well established what that threshold kind of should be. Yeah, and obviously it will really affect the final label propagation solution. Has a huge effect on it.
Yeah.
But I think, label propagation is just a way to find that in a kind of like a very fast iterative manner. That's the way I kind of view it. I think it's already baked into the topology what the labels are going to be in a way, but label propagation kind of like elucidates that, like labeled values. You know what I mean? But yeah, that's also why you have to run it over multiple iterations. If something is like super, highly connected, it can really take some time before before things like
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
before things converge to something, because that's also the nice thing about the brain, obviously, is that the small worldness makes it kind of easier to like get labels for things, because you just get these kind of like networks that always have the same value.
It's done as well to make sure that there are no disconnected nodes in these graphs.
Yeah, I think that's how they also kind of determine the threshold, right? Is like you just kind of look at like what is the minimal connection.
I see.
Yeah, it's a really cool algorithm.
Yeah, I could think of some distributions that would mess with this, right? Potentially, but that's quite interesting. The interplay.
Yeah, I also think there's a really cool kind of relationship between the topology and the label distribution. Like, I wonder if in the future we can kind of go to a one-step approach where you can almost always predict directly like what the labels would be after label propagation. You know what I mean? Because now you have to still iterate, multiple times to finally get a final sort of like value for each node. But I can imagine that it is possible to predict that final kind of value for each node, because it is so dependent on the topology of the graph.
I just have another one question. Can you go back to the slide where you were showing the image and the like label propagation across the image? There was like some baby or something. Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering what the paper like with this image.
What was the question again?
What is the paper for this image? Like, what is the reference for this image?
Which paper did this image come from?
It's not mentioned in the references, but yeah, I didn't cite it. I don't remember the name of the paper here, but I can add it to the references.
Okay. Let me print screens and the references. I'll check myself too. Can you go back to references?
Yeah, this one is really cool.
Yeah, it's a cool little algorithm. How many like alternative, just like a ballpark, do you know of like how many alternative methods other than Urowski exist for this kind of label propagation? Or is this like the principal one?
There are various versions of the Urowski algorithm, which was developed during the previous decade.
Yeah.
I think that the 5 or maybe 4 of them were really influential.
Are they all just like alternatives of Urowski though? And Urowski, it's just like all Urowski all the way down, or is there like another kind of class of algorithm? Is what I was asking. Do you know? You don't know?
So I think they sometimes use deep learning models to assume labels. Have you seen any of that? I don't know anything about it.
Actually, the last paper is pretty about the use of label propagation in
the one by
deep models. Yes, this one.
I think there's a lot of work actually in determining which node you should use as a starting point to do label propagation, or how you should assign the labels to the nodes. And there's different like versions in terms of like, do you do soft label propagation or hard label propagation, and that sort of stuff. Because, for example, it would be much more informative if you have a very high degree node to start from, because then you converge much faster potentially. So a lot of work in this is also like, how do you initialize things? Because that's often what you do is you initialize it to a random distribution with some of them, the correct allocation. And often people do hard label propagation, which means that you assume that it has a label and then you recompute the label based on its neighbors. Because it's also used for unsupervised learning, where you just initialize completely randomly. And then like over like 10 or 100 iterations, at some point, you have a stable solution where each of them has a label assigned to it that is the same as its neighbors. So that is often really hard because, randomly initializing is like a very naive way of doing it, obviously. So there's like a lot of different works in terms of how you do that and whether you use the hard labeling. So you assume that it is, for example, label 2, or whether you use like the value of the labeling. So for example, if it's between 0 and 1, it's like 0.9 instead of 1. And whether that helps in terms of information, because it can also make it less stable, because then it can like start to like kind of go around the 0.5 value, for example.
But I think in general, just it's a clustering problem. But with deep learning, you can do something like else. Like for example, if you have like some labeled samples, you just overfeed your model on these labeled samples, for example, like on dogs and cats, and it will get like some accuracy, but like it can be like warm start for your label propagation. So I think like label propagation uses mostly like mining more samples and like training the deep learning model by mining.
Well, it's also, for example, I don't know if you guys remember that GraphNet paper by Yaman's group about like physical, finding the physical objects in like an image. So that's also where they use it, because what they do is so the nice thing about this is that you can find a variable number of clusters. So if you initialize with 5, like different classes, you can still find 3 clusters instead of 5. So what they did is they didn't have like an intuition about how many classes there would be. And so they would just initialize the graph. So what they do is they get representations. We actually had it in this reading group once. But they use label propagation there to like segment objects in the graph, and then they have this graph of objects, and what they do is it's hierarchical clustering. So they first do clustering on the pixels, then they do clustering on those clusters, then they do clustering on those clusters, and at some point they can model the interactions between objects. Because they know exactly what pixels correspond to these like very low level clusters.
But what's the difference in like there is a cool algorithm called GraphCut, like I think they're related. I think just I think like there is like couple different use cases. There's like active learning part, which is like more like semi-supervised learning, I think. I think there are like different applications, like they have like different kind of like assumption, I guess, and I think they will work differently based on application, I think.
Oh no, for sure. Yeah, I agree with that. I also think that you could probably implement GraphCut using label propagation. I think label propagation is a very like low level algorithm that you can use for a lot of different things. But yeah, for sure. So I sent the paper in the group chat. I don't know if you guys want to.
Minoo, I have a question. So you mentioned the paper label propagation and quadratic criterion.
Yeah.
What did the quadratic criterion do for the algorithm?
And it actually calculates the probability of for each node, and then we use threshold to accept it as which label we want to. It's a probability calculating.
The quadratic criterion is now just a polynomial version of the previous cost function or whatever they called it.
I think, yes.
Could you go to the slide that had the formula with the T's on it and that matrix? That matrix, 'cause I didn't really follow that, and I wanted to go back. The next slide.
This one.
Yeah. So this I don't follow. Can you explain this a bit more? I just don't know what any of this means. What the T bar is. What is T bar? What is so T bar is a matrix of other T bars, and what are the other T bars? Is this like the starting? Yeah. Can you explain this a bit more? Maybe U and L are nodes in the graph. I don't know. What is T? So T is, it's like, I see.
Yeah, it's just the probabilistic transition matrix.
Right.
I think that's the thing that's learned.
Right. Okay. So you construct this matrix with the probabilistic transitions. Can you go back to the next slide? Okay, so that makes sense. And then this is just computed. Yeah.
No.
Well, so TLL is from label to labeled. Okay. So then you can pick the label Y for you. I guess.
Aren't you just doing like the ratio between the
Okay, I think I see.
unlabeled to unlabeled and unlabeled to labeled?
Yeah, that's all that's used. I just like I'm trying to wrap my head around why T-bar is even built as a matrix then. Probably is something else.
I think it's just easier, right? You just have the first
So you're
rows are the
essentially,
nodes you have like initialized with the labels you have, and then the bottom rows are just the unlabeled. And so
Right.
automatically the whole structure looks like this, because otherwise it's a square matrix.
It looks actually as if it's row normalized. So I think each label to label and label to unlabeled is normalized along that row. I think that's why they organize it by a matrix.
okay,
So it has information from both the label to label and L to U. And then U to L and U to U, I think.
okay.
At least that's what I gather from
Then
2.3.
when they actually compute the label, they're only using. I see. Okay.
I think that's the point of the
Right.
normalization.
It makes sense, right? Yeah, because LU is the same as UL.
Yeah.
It is symmetric, right?
Yeah, it's a square matrix. Yeah.
Okay. And so they row normalize, and then they pull those components out, and then use those to update the label. Okay, I'm buying that a bit more now. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think purposefully, the T bar itself is not symmetric, but the UL and LU are symmetric edges, I believe. I'm not positive.
Yeah, it depends on whether it's like directed or undirected, I think.
Yeah,
But I think in this case it's undirected. That's, I assume, just because otherwise you would probably also need to use LU instead of just UL.
yeah.
And yes, in that case it is symmetric if it's undirected. But I think that's true because in the example before, if you go back, like isn't the way they do the forming the probabilities is just using the Euclidean distance and then normalizing, right? So then obviously it's going to be symmetric because Euclidean distance is symmetric.
Yeah. Can you go
Yeah,
back one
okay.
slide?
Yeah, this is symmetric. Yeah, this is 100% symmetric.
It would have to be,
Well, I think the whole matrix T bar is not symmetric, but the edge.
No, I said UL, sorry, UL and LU. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, sorry, my bad.
I mean that it is an undirected graph if you use the local Euclidean distance, because it's just the same weight for both back and forth.
Yep.
Like Wij equals Wji.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's the only way you could get this to be a real transition matrix.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
otherwise you get to LL to UUs.
okay, I think I am following it now.
That's pretty interesting. And it's a highly cited paper, I think. Right? It's a well-worn.
This seems to be like, yeah, this is like the cornerstone of the field. Ooh, very cool.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for showing us.
Okay, thanks, guys.
See y'all.
Bye.